Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. This past weekend, Nate Diaz was in an altercation on the street where he choked out a Logan Paul lookalike and then dropped him to the pavement. And now charges have been pressed, and there is a warrant out for Nate Diaz's arrest for second-degree battery. And I wanted to make a video discussing this topic. We're going to look at the videos. There's multiple videos now. Ariel Helwani's posting an alternate angle. So we're going to look at the original video. We're going to look at the alternate angle. And the real reason I'm making this video is I usually don't cover certain topics like this, the drama around the sport, when it's stupid like street altercations or weigh-in altercations. You know, there's plenty of YouTube channels who will make videos about topics like this and talk in circles for 15 minutes, basically saying nothing. But I really thought the real story here is the MMA community's response and the MMA media's response, because I believe I'm going to get a lot of backlash for my opinion on this topic. And I really have seen very few basically stating the same opinion as mine. And I felt like this was so egregious. And I've seen some particular tweets from MMA media members, which we're going to call out later in the video, that I thought were so egregious, it inspired me to make this video. I had to make this video. Okay, so what is the situation? Nate Diaz, former UFC fighter, he left the UFC, fought out his contract because he wanted to go pursue YouTube boxing. And just recently, it was announced that Nate Diaz will be boxing Jake Paul, I think sometime in August. And we're going to discuss whether or not this whole incident could affect that boxing match. But apparently Nate Diaz was at some misfit boxing event Saturday night. There was an altercation at the actual event. This is not the original, or this is not the main altercation that we're talking about, which was out on the street. But there was an altercation inside the arena. And Nate Diaz has been known to basically be a troublemaker. There's been brawls at PFL events with Habib. There was the incident where a reporter said something about Nate Diaz's teammate, and then when he saw that reporter, he slapped the reporter. And Nate Diaz has been a perpetual troublemaker for years. And to start off the story, essentially, of what happened with Nate Diaz this past weekend is he was at the boxing event, and we're going to take a look at this clip as well. Somebody behind him said something to him that triggered him. He turns around and beams a water bottle at this person. Apparently, it's some social media influencer. Let's take a look at that video, and then we're going to react. So there you see it. Somebody says something behind Nate Diaz. He stands up, picks up a water bottle, and beams it behind him. And what I really want to point out is because there's a lot of fans out there that's like, Nate Diaz is a gangster. Nate Diaz is a savage. Nate Diaz isn't scared to street fight anyone. Nate Diaz threw that water bottle, beamed that water bottle. And then what did he do right afterwards? He ducked under the crowd and ran to a safe distance before flipping that person off from a safe distance about 50 feet away. Now, this isn't the main part of the story. I just wanted to show it to kind of set up what happened that night. And I mean, at this point, it's essentially a grown man acting like a 15-year-old, 16-year-old to throw a water bottle, to beam a water bottle at someone. I'm not going to sit here and clutch my pearls over it, but come on now. You're supposed to be a grown man. You're at some boxing event. You can't handle somebody maybe saying something to you, 3 rows behind you without you picking up a water bottle and just beaming it at that person. I think it's ridiculous. It could have hit someone that wasn't even involved. And then you run off and give the middle finger. I just think it's childish behavior. Now you fast forward to later that night, and this is where reports kind of get a little bit cloudy. Supposedly this group that they ran into on the street was related to the whole water bottle incident, but that's not 100% confirmed. I don't know for sure. It could have been related. It could have been unrelated, but there's some MMA media members saying that it was related and that the person that he choked out on the street was with the group that he threw the water bottle at. But nonetheless, there's this altercation on the street. Nate Diaz and this Logan Paul lookalike. Apparently, that's basically his entire career, is he's a lookalike of Logan Paul, which is just completely bizarre. And that's really something that I don't even want to delve into at all, because I can't even stand all this social media stuff that's infiltrating MMA reporting, which we're going to talk about later in this video. but there's the original video that came out of the altercation on the street with Nate Diaz and this Logan Paul lookalike. Let's take a look at that video, and then we're going to react to it. So there you have it, Nate Diaz in some type of street altercation. There's some type of like brawl going on in the background. Then you see the Logan Paul lookalike walk forward. He has his hands in the air. It looks like he's trying to say, look, I don't want to fight, so on and so forth. And then the camera's kind of shaky, kind of pans away a little bit. But next thing you know, Nate Diaz chokes him out with a guillotine and then drops his lifeless body to the ground with his head smacking off the pavement, which is incredibly dangerous. And when this came out, it was kind of damning, but most of the MMA community was like, Nate Diaz, 10-8, free Nate Diaz, you know, talking about, oh, you shouldn't approach Nate Diaz like that on the street. And I thought this video was pretty clear-cut, and we're going to look at the alternate angle here in a second. But it essentially looks like this guy's trying to calm Nate Diaz down, trying to say, look, I don't want to fight. I don't want anything to do with this. Nate puts him in a guillotine and chokes him out, and then drops him on the pavement, which also is incredibly dangerous. You hit your head at a weird angle, it can be the end of your life. So I think horrible move by Nate Diaz to start off, and we're going to give my full reaction in a minute when we look at this alternate angle, because then just recently what kind of inspired me to make this video, Ariel Helwani tweeted out, and he said, this is an alternate angle of the much talked about street fight that happened on Friday in New Orleans. Paints a more complete picture of the madness going on. And maybe I'm taking this the wrong way. You guys will have to let me know down in the comments. But I took this as Ariel Helwani saying, there's more to it. Nate Diaz, he should have been able to defend himself. And like, we're going to see more of maybe this Logan Paul lookalike whose name is apparently like Rodney, defending himself. There was a reason for Nate Diaz defending himself. The way I took this tweet was Ariel Helwani saying, look, this secondary video of an alternate angle vindicates Nate Diaz, and it's not a big deal, and essentially he was justified in his actions. But that's not really what we saw in this alternate angle, and I actually thought the alternate angle that Ariel Helwani tweeted out was more damning to Nate Diaz and his crew. Let's take a look at that, and then we'll come back and react. So there you have the alternate angle that Ariel Helwani was kind of hyping up. You really don't see much more than what you saw in the original. I mean, it kind of pans away at the same time. It shows more of the behind the scenes like brawl. And the only thing I really picked up on, and I thought this was even more damning for Nate Diaz, is while Nate Diaz is choking this guy out, his crew is then punching him to the body, basically cheap shotting him to the body. And then when the guy kind of went down to where more of the brawl was going on, there was a guy being held up against the wall. It looked by like security or police, and somebody with a shirt that said represent on the back threw 2 cheap shots looking to punch that guy in the face. And because of the shirt, you can clearly see he is with Nate Diaz. So not only do you have now this alternate angle where Nate Diaz and his crew is essentially cheap shotting an unconscious man or close to unconscious man who's in a guillotine via Nate Diaz, you also see some sucker punches that ultimately don't land. But what's crazy to me, and we're going to get to some more tweets from MMA Media here in a second that I absolutely have to call out and basically is the entire inspiration for this video. But what I see here is a 38-year-old man in Nate Diaz who's perpetually in trouble. And he chokes this guy out who, in my opinion, it looks like this guy was not trying to fight. So he attacked a guy who did not appear like he was attempting to fight Nate Diaz. He chokes him out. His crew throws follow-up shots to him while he's being choked out. And then he drops him on the pavement. And I know I've stressed that a couple times. Incredibly dangerous. This guy did have a head injury. He was bleeding from the back of his head. One wrong hit, with your head, you can end your life. And this could be much different for Nate Diaz had there been a different outcome. There's been countless stories where people get into a bar fight, there's one punch thrown, somebody gets knocked unconscious, and then they die afterwards. So incredibly reckless by Nate Diaz. But what really irks me in general, and this is where I'm going to get a lot of heat for this, the MMA community as a whole is defending Nate Diaz. They're saying, yeah, he had a right to defend himself, and, you know, you don't walk up on Nate Diaz, and that guy had it coming. And don't get me wrong, I don't like the whole YouTube, you know, Logan Paul, Jake Paul, and their entire posse, whoever you want to, I don't even know who's all in it, but I don't like that group either. But this guy, from what we've seen in this video, was not attempting to hit Nate Diaz, did not look like he was attempting to fight Nate Diaz, and Nate Diaz choked him out and dropped him on the ground where he hit his head. And I think the fact that you have a 38-year-old man who has this history, this isn't GSP randomly getting into a street fight. Nate Diaz is slapping reporters where they can't defend themselves, where he's a trained former UFC fighter. At one point, he was considered elite in the UFC, where he's choking out a guy with limited training, which we're going to talk about. Ariel Helwani brought that up in a minute. But he's choking out a guy with limited training and then dropping him on the concrete. I think it's disgusting, and I think Nate Diaz should go to jail. Honestly, I think Nate Diaz needs to be charged to the fullest extent. I'm not saying I want to see his life over. You know, obviously that's not going to happen. I'm not even saying I want to see him in jail for years. Nate Diaz has continued to act like a child for years. He is almost 40 years old. And for some reason, because he has this cult-like following, everyone just defends him. The MMA media defends him, and we're going to look at two more tweets from two different people, Ariel Helwani being one of them in a second. But the MMA community defends him, the MMA media defends him, and they're just vigorously defending him. And then the people who maybe are impartial or want to call out Nate Diaz, they don't do it because they don't want the backlash of the Diaz cult coming after them. I don't care about that. I'm going to get plenty of backlash on this video. I think Nate Diaz has shown to be a clown. And what I think is going on here is Nate Diaz has taken entirely too much brain damage over the course of his UFC career. And it's clear what he did. He fought out his UFC contract because he knew he couldn't compete in the UFC anymore. And I'm not trying to sit here and be Dana White and delegitimize Nate Diaz because now he's out of the UFC. But Nate Diaz was essentially a washed up fighter when he left. He was still a big star. There were still some fun fights that the UFC could have made. It didn't happen. Nate Diaz fought out his contract because he wanted to go box YouTubers. That says it all. And now he's beating up random dudes on the street for fun. And he's been in constant altercations for the past 5 to 10 years. It seems like every other month there's a new Nate Diaz altercation. And I just think it's childish behavior. And I hope that he does get arrested, which he will because there is a warrant out for his arrest. And I hope he does face severe punishment for committing assault. You can't just assault somebody because you want to assault somebody. You can assault somebody if you're defending yourself, but that was not the case in this instant, which is backed up by video footage. Now, I'm not going to sit here and act like this is the end of the world. I'm not going to sit here and act like it's the end of the world, but I am so sick and tired of all the MMA community defending Nate Diaz, you know, acting like he's a gangster. He's beating up some dude who literally looks like a 50-year-old version of Logan Paul and potentially putting him in a dangerous situation where he bumps his head the wrong way, his life could be over. So I just think it's an embarrassing act for a former UFC fighter to be caught on camera doing. And I think it's awfully funny how somebody like Ariel Helwani, who went in on Dana White, Dana White's however many years old in the club in Mexico, smacking his wife up. But then you have Nate Diaz essentially assaulting somebody. And in my opinion, this guy was not looking to assault Nate. And you have Ariel Helwani going out there and defend him. And you have the MMA community going out there and defend him. And the reason Ariel Helwani's out there defending him is because Ariel Helwani's friends with Nate Diaz. Ariel Helwani likes to push Nate Diaz. Ariel Helwani knows that Nate Diaz is a star within the MMA community, and he knows most of the fans will be on his side. So he's going to defend Nate. Now, he posted something that really, really irked me. And I'm going to put the tweet up on the screen. He tweeted out, contrary to initial belief, Diaz didn't choke out Logan Paul. I don't think anybody really ever thought that. That was Rodney Peterson, a pro boxer with a record of 1-0 and a blue belt in BJJ. He's a TikTok influencer fighter who gained notoriety impersonating Logan Paul. This is baffling to me. What this is this is Ariel Helwani carrying water for Nate Diaz. Why did he have to put in there that this guy's a pro boxer who's 1-0 and a blue belt in BJJ? I don't care if it was Dale Earnhardt's spirit himself back from the dead. I don't care if it was Chuck Norris. I don't care who it was. You can't just assault somebody just because you want to assault somebody. You can't choke somebody unconscious. Meanwhile, your crew is cheap shotting them to the body and get away with it. And then you drop the man on the pavement and hit his head, and he could lose his life. And Ariel Helwani's out there saying, well, he's a pro boxer. He's 1-0. He's 1-0. Why is Ariel Helwani doing this? He's friends with Nate Diaz. He wants to push Nate Diaz. He doesn't want Nate Diaz to get in any trouble. And also, he knows the MMA community is on his side. So he's like, well, let me help push this narrative. Nate Diaz isn't in the wrong. Ariel Helwani knows that he can dictate the MMA narrative. He can dictate the MMA community, a large portion of it, to the narrative that is set. And that is what he's doing. He's defending Nate. He's scared. I think Ariel Helwani is genuinely scared that this could cause Nate Diaz versus Jake Paul to be canceled. That's what he's worrying about. And this is where I kind of crap on the MMA media a little bit, because the MMA media is just an embarrassment. Because, and I've talked about this recently, they have one foot in the grave, the other on a banana peel. Because the MMA media is so bad, most of the time the only articles they're writing is just posting pictures of a fighter's tweets. That's how lazy MMA reporting has become nowadays. They love to just get hyper-focused on issues like this. They're like, oh my God, I can generate a lot of clicks. I can generate traffic. People are going to care when I tweet out about this quote-unquote street fight with Nate Diaz. And they look to latch onto these big names in these, polarizing moments. And that's exactly what Ariel Helwani is doing. He is latching onto this moment because he knows Nate Diaz is a big name. And also, he wants to set the narrative. That is what he's doing here. He wants to set the narrative, and he is defending Nate Diaz. And it's an absolute embarrassment. But he's doing it because basically, and I'm not saying Ariel Helwani is in the entirety of MMA media, and he's not like necessarily a reporter. He's more of an interviewer, and he does a great job at interviews. But he's doing this because he wants to generate, some type of controversy around him. He wants to keep this issue alive. That's why the MMA media is so focused on this YouTube boxing. They were pushing for Nate Diaz versus Jake Paul for years before Nate Diaz even basically left the UFC. They were pushing for this. This is why Ariel Helwani was so adamant in covering Nate Diaz's contract dispute with the UFC, because he wanted Nate Diaz out of his contract so that he could go box Jake Paul. And I think Ariel Helwani is worried that that fight may get canceled now. I don't necessarily think that happens. I think what's going to ultimately happen, I think this guy, Rodney Peterson, I think what he's going to do is he's going to settle out of court with Nate Diaz. He's probably going to sue him. He's going to make a decent amount of money. Nate Diaz is going to pay him $50,000, $100,000, maybe even more. And basically, the charges are going to be dropped. But you know what I wish would happen? I wish Nate Diaz would go to jail. And I know people are going to hate to hear that be said, but you can't go around as almost a 40-year-old grown man. You can't just go around assaulting anyone you want. The reporter he slapped, everyone acted like it was funny and it was cool because nobody likes that reporter from, I think it was Full Send MMA. I don't even like that guy. You can't go around just slapping anyone you want just because you think you can. It's basically Nate Diaz is a bully. Because you know what? And I really believe this. And Nate Diaz has always kind of been like this. He can't bully anyone in the top 10 or top 15 of the lightweight division or welterweight division. So now he's gone on to fight YouTube boxers, and he likes to bully untrained people outside in street fights. And it's an embarrassment. Now, one more thing I want to touch on before I end this video. Mark Raimondi, who works for ESPN, what an absolute embarrassment he is. Because he put out a similar statement to Ariel Helwani. Let's take a look at what Man said. What Mark Raimondi said. He said, there is a video of Diaz being confronted by an influencer, Rodney Peterson, during a melee with people brawling around them. Peterson seemed to engage Diaz, who appeared to choke Peterson unconscious with a guillotine. The back of Peterson's head hit the pavement when Diaz let him go. Peterson, 34, 6'4", and has combat sports experience himself. Aside from being known somewhat on social media as Logan Paul's lookalike, he is 1-0 as a pro boxer, a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and has competed multiple times in MMA as an amateur. Why is any of that relevant? Just because this guy has one boxing match and is a blue belt in BJJ, oh, that's fine. That's what they're doing. They're trying to water down what Nate Diaz did. What Nate Diaz did was assault essentially a regular civilian, choked him unconscious, and dropped him on the pavement where this guy's head hit off the pavement and could have caused a serious injury. That's what Marc Raimondi is here doing. He works for ESPN, but he's a known YouTube boxer, just lover, and always promoting like the side of MMA that would be conflated with WWE. That's what he wants. And he's out here defending Nate Diaz because he wants to carry water for Nate Diaz, because Nate Diaz is good for business. These stars, whether it be Nate Diaz, whether it be Conor McGregor, name the star, any star in MMA, the reason these media members are so quick to defend them is because these guys are indirectly putting money in their pockets based on clicks, based on articles, based on YouTube views, stuff like that. I'm not saying, Marc Raimondi is making money off this necessarily tweet, but he wants to help set the narrative that, oh, Nate Diaz was just defending himself. And he knows the MMA community is already on his side. So why not just tweet this out? This is a popular opinion. Nate Diaz didn't just choke out an untrained person. This guy had one boxing fight, and he's a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It was perfectly fine for Nate Diaz to choke him out. Nate Diaz, this should be a win on his record. Let's put it on his record now. Add it to his tapology. New Orleans win. It's disgusting. It's despicable. Ariel Helwani, Marc Raimondi should be straight up embarrassed of themselves, trying to water down choking a man unconscious who never threw a strike at you, who never appeared to look like he was going to attack you, and then dropping him to the ground. But yeah, it's all right because he's a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. What a horrible, and I don't understand. Could someone point out to me, why is that even relevant? If this guy was an accountant, would they be talking about, he worked for H&R Block, he worked for TurboTax? No, they wouldn't. Why are they saying that he's a blue belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Like that matters, like that's relevant. This is despicable. This is disgusting. And I had to make a video about it, even though I know a lot of you aren't going to agree with me. A lot of the MMA community will defend Nate Diaz because he has a cult-like following. And I like Nate Diaz. This is coming from a fan of Nate Diaz. But he's gotten away with this type of stuff for too long. He acts like a teenager in a grown man's body who's been trained in jiu-jitsu and he's been training as a fighter for decades, essentially. And he's beating up people on the street. It's an embarrassment to the MMA community. I think Nate Diaz is an embarrassment of a man. And I think Marc Raimondi, Ariel Helwani, and anybody else in the MMA media landscape that is defending this type of behavior is disgusting. But we've seen it time and time again. When Conor McGregor does something that is not particularly a good look, they kind of brush over it. They'll talk about it, but they kind of defend him because they're setting the narrative, because they don't want to piss that fighter off. Also, that's another reason Ariel Helwani and Marc Raimondi is doing what they're doing, because they don't want to lose access to Nate Diaz. More so Ariel Helwani, because he likes to do interviews with Nate Diaz that draws clicks and draws views. So let me know what you guys think about all this down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. And thank you so much for watching.